Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. President. I applaud the work of Senator Murkowski, who is perhaps uniquely qualified here to find ways of doing bipartisan work, and I just applaud her for her efforts on this bill and other things. For too many people, Mr. President, hard work isn't paying off. Even people with supposedly middle-class jobs don't feel stable. Wages are flat, the cost of everything is up: healthcare, childcare, college, prescription drugs, and especially housing. When you love this country, you fight for the people who make it work. You fight for dignity of work. But you can't talk about dignity of work without tackling the biggest item in most families' budget: housing. Dignity of work means living with dignity, whether you write a rent check or pay a mortgage, whether you're saving for a down payment or just looking for a safe place to lay down your head at night, whether you live in a city or a suburb in Hamilton County, where my colleague, Senator Portman, who's in the chamber, lives, in Richland County, where I grew up, a medium-sized city, or a rural area. Fundamentally, we all pretty much want the same thing: a place that's safe and a community we care about, where we can get to work and our children have a chance, have a good school with room for our family, whether that's 3 kids or an aging parent or a beloved pet. In our case, our dogs Franklin and Walter. You should get to define what home looks like for you. You should be able to find it. You should be able to afford it without crippling stress every single month when the rent check is due or whether your mortgage payment is due. People feel that's out of reach, even when they work hard and do everything right. Right now, a quarter of renters, 1 out of 4 renters, spend more than half their income on housing. Think of that. 1 out of 4 renters pay more than half their income on housing. One thing goes wrong in their life: their car breaks down, their child gets sick, they get laid off from work for 1 week. Something happens with the repair of their roof. One thing goes wrong, and their life turns upside down. 7 out of the 10 fastest growing jobs in this country don't pay enough for a 2-bedroom apartment. And we know housing is central to every aspect of families' lives. Matthew Desmond, author of Evicted, a book that I've spoken about on this floor in the past and to people all over my state and around the country. Matthew Desmond, in his book Evicted, I asked him to come in. I bought his book. I brought in a number of senators to listen to him. And inscribing his book, he wrote, "Home equals life." If you don't have a decent, safe, clean, affordable place to live, your life is so often turned upside down. The housing crisis affects different families in different ways, but it touches pretty much everyone. A safe, stable home is the foundation for opportunity. It determines where your kids go to school. It determines how far you have to travel to get to work. It determines where you go shopping. It determines whether you feel safe walking around at night. And we know where you live, maybe most importantly, affects the quality of your health care. It affects your education, it affects your job opportunities, and where you live affects your life expectancy. Housing stress affects people with all kinds of jobs in all parts of the country. It's why I'm holding roundtables all over my state, beginning over the past 2 weeks to talk with Ohioans about their struggles with housing and what we can do to make it easier for everyone to find and afford a home. So far, I've done roundtables in Toledo and Youngstown, Northwest Ohio and Eastern Ohio. I heard from Ohioans about the challenges that too many people face. We heard about how interconnected housing is with other issues in people's lives. Wages that don't keep up with the cost of living, how housing instability can affect your stress levels and your health, and how hard it can be to get financing to buy a house or start a business in neighborhoods that have been left behind. We heard about the power in Youngstown and Toledo. I heard about the power that shady landlords have over tenants and about predatory lease-to-own land contracts. People also talked about how upfront costs aren't just an issue, the down payment you make on buying a home to get a mortgage. To rent, you often have to have the first month's rent, the last month's rent, and a security deposit. That can be a huge obstacle to so many moderate and low-income families. 40%, this number is stunning, 40% of Americans say they can't come up with $400 in an emergency. 40% of Americans can't come up with $400 $400 in an emergency. When it's that hard for so many people to save, a deposit can seem just impossible. We can't untangle many of these issues from the legacy of redlining and decades of bad public policy decisions by members, I would acknowledge, from both parties at all levels of government, when we have systematically denied people of color the ability to choose where they live and build wealth through home ownership. More than half of African Americans and Latinx renters are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. More than half of people of color spend 30% or more on their housing, making them much more likely to have a high housing cost burdens than white seniors have had. That means that Black and Latino families have less to spend on health care, less to spend on food, less to spend on transportation. And it's not just about differences in income, all very real. More than 50 years after we passed the Fair Housing Act to prohibit discrimination in housing, African Americans make up 13% of the population, but 21% of people experiencing poverty in this country are African American, and 40% of the people experiencing homelessness are African American. Think about that. 21% of people experiencing poverty, but 40% of the people experiencing homelessness. That tells you this just isn't about income. And we talk to people who are homeless, and none of us gets out as much as we should to, as President Lincoln said, get out and get your public opinion bass. We don't talk to people like that enough, but when you do, you learn that so many people who are homeless have jobs. They don't pay much. They may be part-time. They may cobble together 2 jobs, but they're still homeless. We see the same thing when we look at home ownership. The African-American home ownership rate is 30% below the white home ownership rate. And analysts have tried to explain this with income and education, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Something more troubling is going on. With everything else being equal, similarly situated African Americans are less likely to own a home than their similarly situated white counterparts. That's the legacy of redlining. It's a legacy of racial exclusion at work. It might have been in Arkansas, it might have been in Ohio. It's all over this country. From 1934 through 1962, get this, 98% of all FHA mortgages went to white homeowners. We were a country that was about probably 85, 87% white, but 90% of all FHA mortgages went to white homeowners. That's not just a problem of the past. Housing is how people build wealth for generations. Yet with millions of families struggling to afford housing, with massive disparities in access to housing, this administration is turning its back on families, communities, and communities of color. For 3 years, President Trump has been trying to undermine the Fair Housing Act of 1968. I spoke with Mitt Romney, senator from Utah, on the floor about this last week. Senator Romney's father was President Nixon's Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and worked very hard to implement the Fair Housing Act, made a lot of progress in 1969 and 1970. So much of that progress now is being scaled back. That landmark civil rights law made discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing illegal for the first time. It was supposed to set us on a path to a country where everyone could find and afford a safe, stable home, regardless of their gender, regardless of their race, with access to opportunity. But instead of getting us closer, the Trump administration's making things worse. They're trying to make it harder to root out policies and practice that have a hidden discriminatory effect on people by cutting the decades-old disparate impact standard. They're rolling back the 2015 HUD rule that would have finally implemented the Fair Housing Act's requirement that we affirmatively further fair housing throughout our communities. And President Trump's budget will only make the affordable housing crisis worse for families struggling in every community in this country. The administration would eliminate funds communities use to create and preserve affordable housing and make home ownership possible for working families. The Community Development Block Grant is an example, and the Home Investment Partnership Program. The administration wants to cut the already insufficient federal rental assistance we have. They want to get rid of funding for the Housing Trust Fund and Capital Magnet Fund, even though this funding comes from the GSEs, the government-sponsored enterprises, not the federal budget, to make it still harder to build homes and apartment people can actually afford. To add insult to injury, the Trump administration proposed to make mortgages more expensive for working families to both reduce the deficit that they created. We know we have trillion-dollar deficits now because of, even in times of growth in the economy, because of a tax cut that went overwhelmingly to the rich. And even though that the administration made these mortgages more expensive for working families to reduce the deficit they created and to supposedly level the playing field for Wall Street, as if Wall Street doesn't have enough advantages without our continuing to shovel money to them. We need to fight back. Any economic policy that doesn't put housing front and center ignores families' biggest expense and biggest need. When we see housing problems in Appalachia, Ohio, or in Toledo, or in big coastal cities, or in small towns, it's clear this is a national problem. It needs a national response. I'm going to keep hosting roundtables around Ohio to hear directly from Ohioans about the struggles they face. I'm inviting Ohioans to go to my website, brown.senate.gov. I'm inviting Ohioans to go to brown.senate.gov and share your story about housing. You can do it with your name attached, or you can do it anonymously, but we value these stories. We've gotten already hundreds just out of these two roundtables, and the attention around the roundtables. We've gotten hundreds of many heartrending stories and instructive stories and ideas for changes. We need to hear your struggles. We need to hear your ideas. Congress cannot ignore these challenges. We can't just let the administration take away the tools we have and we've used for years to try to make this better, to make people's lives better, whether they're in small towns or big cities. If we want to make this country work better for everyone, we can't shrink from these challenges, Mr. President. When work has dignity, when people live their lives with dignity, everyone can find and afford a safe place to call home. I yield the floor.